Looks like we are locked in and working on Facebook, waiting for the YouTube again to come on. Yeah, it looks like we're working. Wonderful. All right, wonderful. So here we are. Welcome to the deep dive. This episode will be dedicated to the opening track on the album Currents, which is entitled Think of the Night. And for those of you not familiar with the music, let me just give you a little sample of what this song sounds like. So here we go from the beginning.
The sadness comes, just a momentary pain. Think of the night, think of the night, think of it drowning in rain. For a moment I felt electrical ecstasy. For a moment the gods knelt down in front of me. For a moment I held the night till everyone believe it to me.
All right. So that's Think of the Night. Basically, you're hearing kind of your standard rock band drums, bass, some electric guitar, some acoustic guitar, some vocals. A string orchestra was just about to make itself known in the mix. So I thought I'd really go back and think a bit about how this album and this song in particular was recorded. Ben Whitman, one of my oldest friends in the world, Greg Porter being probably the oldest. Ben was scheduled to come in to the Boston area and track with Greg and I and maybe some other players. And then, of course, COVID. So travel restrictions. Ben lives in Toronto. All sorts of questions arose, and so it was determined that rather than get together in one room, we would have to parse this stuff out and add tracks sort of one at a time. So Ben recorded all of the drums himself in his basement. He's not only an astounding drummer, but he's a great record producer and engineer, so how fortunate for me to have that option. What that meant is that I had to create something for Ben to play to. So in the earliest stages of most of the songs for the record, what that meant for me was putting together a little demo that would consist of at least my guitar, a vocal of some sort, and a click track, something to keep everybody honest, something that Ben could lock into perhaps more than my ragged guitar playing, and that then would also facilitate an ease of editing. And that's an important thing. We'll get to that a little bit later. So I will embarrass myself here, but I'll actually tout Ben's talent, because if we scroll into this, what Ben was sent to play to, and I won't, I don't even know if I can find the vocal in the manner in which it was originally recorded, but essentially what Ben would have received would have been something that sounded like this. Actually, not quite like that. Let me go back and unmute that click. So you'll see in this long strand of stuff here, I do have a click track. And this would have been what Ben heard. Actually, one more time. This would have been what Ben heard. There would have been a vocal to help guide him for the song form, but that's pretty much what he had to play to. So when you compare kind of the thin guitar sound, the fact that it's pretty static all the way through the recording, and that click track, for Ben to have to imagine what a band's going to sound like means he's sort of, as I say, imagining the dynamic that might come about when you add in all the parts and the layers, where's the big fill that needs to hit that chorus hard, etc. So I marvel even more when I think about what Ben is playing to versus what Ben ends up actually sounding like. So to demonstrate that, let's solo up these drum tracks for a bit and just sort of see what the performance of drums alone sounds like. And then I'll get a little bit more into how I'm mixing the drums, because I think that's sometimes interesting. So going back, this is what we would have heard Ben do. And let me make sure that I've got those acoustic guitars. Yeah. Being red, meaning they should be muted as well. We don't want them. Okay. There we go. So for me, the energy from the track really starts here with Ben. And you can hear he's doing quite a lot with cymbals while keeping the track going. Okay. Couple of things. Okay, Ben, why don't you take a break? So, the sound of Ben's drums in his basement was maybe not the ideal drum track sound. I won't go deep into sort of pulling off the processing to some degree that I put on in terms of equalization, because I ended up having to EQ the drums differently than what they sounded like when he sent them to me. Not necessarily as a fault of his recording technique. His recording technique gave me fairly clean, uncolored tracks, as it were. But once you start adding instruments, different instruments need to hold on to certain parts of the frequency spectrum. Sometimes the drums are covering a lot of that. So you might choose to emphasize things in the drums that aren't there normally, or pull some things away from the drums that might be present normally. And I did a combination of both. But one of the things that's most obvious when you're listening to this is that the drums are being sent not to the sound of Ben's basement, but rather to some outboard effects that simulate different sorts of rooms. So here's the drums without that. Not bad, but not necessarily sounding like the big band in the stadium of your mind that I envisioned for the track. So there's actually several things going on. I neglected to mute something I forgot I was sending the drums to. I did know that I was sending the drums to a combination of an effects program that simulates the reverb chambers at Capitol Studios, the round building in Hollywood. That sounds like this. With the effect, without the effect. Now, the snare drum is definitely being sent there, but so are some of the other drum set mics, the tom mics, for example, and a little bit of the overhead, so that the entire kit, rather than sound like you've got a very dry overhead cymbals and such with this crazy big reverberant snare, it's a little bit of marriage of the two. I do have a separate effect that's dedicated solely to the snare. So the snare does have a larger sound in terms of reverberation than the kit itself. So let's play without that snare plate. You hear the reverberation, now the extra snare. Might be considered subtle to you, but it's there. And then the other thing I forgot was that I ended up feeling like once I put all the instruments in, boy, those drums needed even more reverberation. So I ended up sending them to a plate reverb that I'm actually using for my vocal. In a way, that's just being lazy. In a way, it's minimizing the numbers of plugins I'm trying to run. But one other thing that it does is it unites the vocal and the drums in the same reverberant space. So it's less schizophonic and a little more, all in one organic, as we might fake say. So with all of the reverberation.
For a moment, the guys knelt down in front of me.
And when I opened up that vocal reverb, we heard the vocal as well. But that's because they're sharing it. So that's sort of the combination of those two things. All right, let's not solo this so much. Although I do want to solo one other thing in the drums to show you something that I commonly do. I think probably, I could be wrong about saying every time, but nearly all times, which is to go in and do a little type of editing that's not the same as editing takes. I'll give away some secrets here. Just if we look at, these are solo tracks, so all of this stuff here is the drum set. And you'll note, I'll zoom in a little bit. So these lines, these little chunked up little sections here indicate that I have made some edits in the drum performance. Many of them right at the beginning here. I think that's probably a combination of me wanting a type of fill for the introduction. Maybe there were some timing issues between my click, my guitar, and Ben's playing. Hard to know. I can say that once we get basically through that introduction, I have a feeling that's what it is. I think I changed my mind about how thick I wanted the instrumentation for the intro versus the rest of the song. And so through no fault of Ben's playing, there may not have been the dynamic energy at the top that I was looking for. But when we zoom back out, we recognize, okay, once we got into that, from here on out, it's pretty much the take that Ben gave me without edit. Impressive. Oop, there's one. Okay, so the outro involved me tweaking Ben a little bit too. But let's look at the real tweakage. You're looking maybe here at all this gap and stuff. What that is these are dedicated to the toms. So rack tom 1, rack tom 2, and the floor tom. I'm treating those things very differently. If we look here at, let's look at the floor tom. So, wow, I'm looking for a resonant tone, the sort of fundamental that's in this floor tom, and I'm boosting the hell out of it. That's a really steep curve, especially in these low frequencies. Kids, be careful with this stuff at home. You'll wreck your speakers. I'm matching that with a little bit of a boost here around 4K. That's, of course, the sound of the stick on the beater. So you get both the attack of that, but you also get the boom out of the drum. Now, if I soloed this up, it would be too much. It's too much low end, too much of that attack. But in the context of the rest of the kit, it positions the floor tom with a little closer mic'd identity, even though you're hearing that floor tom in the overhead mics. It's those other sounds that are leaking into the toms that are what these big gaps are about here. Yeah, so let me just expose a little weakness here. And if I kill the solo, but solo the floor, you'll hear the introduction. We're listening to just the floor tom mic, and what you'll hear is the floor tom and the rest of the drum kit that's leaking into that mic. That's a lot of drum kit leaking into just the floor tom mic. And if we did that to all of these tracks, there would be leakage of the drum kit into microphones that are positioned specifically to record just whatever tom, racks, or the floor. They're not positioned to record the kit in a beautiful way. They're there for that specific drum. The way the kit sounds in those mics is really strange, very thin, out of phase in some instances with the rest of the kit. So Here's a technique that I learned from an engineer back in the analog tape days, which is if you can simply open up those tracks when the drum's being played and get rid of the track when it's not being played, you can reduce all that leakage. Old school analog days, live days, noise gates were invented to take care of these same types of things. The idea being when there was enough signal, they would open up and you would hear that drum, and then once it became less about that particular drum, the gate would close and you'd hear nothing. It's a great way. 80% of the time it works well. 20% of the time it works well in recording. And the reason for that is not all drummers are machines. And sometimes they play with dynamics. And sometimes they're actually playing the drum you want to hear, but they're just not playing it loud enough to open up the gate. And frequently you would go, oh no, and that would be awful. So now, if you can, you record all of it. But then after the fact, you can go in and you can carefully, as I've done, go through here and make all of those edits, only opening up the track when the toms appear. So then, if we solo up just the toms, let me see if I can get all three of them at some point in here. Oh, there's some stuff. You would just hear this. Etc. You'll note that I am creating little fade outs, this little line here to diminish, just so you don't hear it abruptly vanish in your headset. If I don't solo up those rack drums, but rather solo up the drums themselves, let me go back here and just grab the drum group. You'll hear what I'm talking about as we watch those toms come through again. So we're here. Now we'll hear all the drum kit. Now you'll notice that for this section of the song, that floor tom is really active, and I decided to not go in and micro edit it, but rather to let it be open. However, the rack tom is less active, and I decided to go ahead and do the edits there. You'll see this little gap here in the floor. That's because the floor stops playing, Ben does instead of snare drum fill, and I'm trying to eliminate the snare in the floor mic. So there's that gap. That's a little bit, particular. You could probably get away with not doing that, but once I'd set up the template of how the snare was sounding, the leakage from the floor mics changed the way the snare sounded. So in a big snare moment, I elected to try to give it back its character. These are questions that one can deal with in mixing, producing, etc. But that's something that you'll see on other deep dives. I always edit the drums in that way. Okay. So that's the drum kit, and Ben's great playing. Let's see what else to talk about here. And the next bit maybe would be to talk about something we haven't yet heard, which is the orchestra. Now, when I deal with orchestras, that's a whole other ballgame. This is this section here, what we're calling main LCR, LFRF, blah, 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 double LCR, lots of stuff going on. Well, this is the strings. And what we mean by all this is the way in which I record strings has evolved over time. But the thing that I've arrived at is splitting the difference between a technologically stacked and overdubbed set of string players to fake an orchestra versus the sound that you get when you have several musicians playing at the same time. Why? Well, a couple of reasons. Economically, orchestras are very expensive, right? You're paying each number of musicians to play their part. And the question is, well, just how many violin players do I really need? Will it be worth the extra hundreds of dollars to have that extra violin, or can I get away with it? And I'm in a studio. I can, in fact, overdub, meaning I could take one violin player, record that violin player twice. Now I have two violins. I have double the violins. In the first days of recording strings, I often recorded a string quartet. So one violin one, a violin two, a viola, a cello. It's a lovely sound. And if you're writing music for a kind of intimacy, not on the grand scale, but something much more localized, a string quartet's a beautiful way to go. Interestingly, when you're arranging for strings, often you are creating the same parts for voice writing, but you're thinking about larger numbers of instruments assigned per part. If you go to a symphony orchestra, you're likely to see any number, let's say 6 to 8 to 10 first violins, same number of second violins, maybe not quite as many violas, maybe not quite as many cellos, but you may be looking at 4 or 5 cellists, 6 cellos, 4, 5, 6, 7 violas. These are larger orchestras, 8 to 10 upper voice strings. That's more money than I can afford. Even me, wasting money on everything I do, it just feels like probably money that I don't need to be spending. So what I do instead is create sections where I have, I think on this record, we have 2 cellos, 2 violas, and then 3 violin ones, 3 violin twos. So you are multiple players playing the same part. So you've got 2 cellists playing together and adjusting their intonation, adjusting their bowing, their phrasing, their dynamic to one another, while also doing so to the rest of the string players. So you do get the interplay of musicians that way. That sound of 2, 2, 3, 3, in terms of parts working from the bottom up, is thick, but not quite as thick as I would like orchestrally. So I do a double. Now I have 4 cello, 4 viola, 6 violin 2, 6 violin 1. It's, again, not as big as some of the larger string orchestras might be, but it's splitting the difference. Then the next question is, well, how do we record that? I work at WGBH with Antonio Oliart, who does a lot of live broadcasting of classical ensembles, jazz ensembles. He's really good at getting acoustic sounds to work in one go. It's got to sound great. You don't get to rethink it after the fact. So he does a lovely recording of these sounds that I then treat differently because it's a pop rock record. What he does is we position the string players as if they were on stage. We have a couple of groups of microphones that you might find if you were at Boston Symphony, if you're at the Symphony Hall. You might see just a pair of microphones or maybe 3 microphones sort of in the center of all of this, capturing the sound of all of those string players in sort of a stereo field. The 3 is another artifact I don't need to get into. You might find that there's a pair of microphones maybe further back in the hall, getting the sound of those strings more at a distance. We do a simulation of that in the studio at GBH. So you've got some front mics and a couple of back mics. That's what these LCR is, those front mics. And then the fronts and backs are another set of microphones that he has that record in 2 different directions. So we're sort of capturing the grouping sound. But then I have what's called main violin 1, 2, cello, viola here. We take another microphone and put it close to just the violin ones, close to just the 2s, to the violas, to the cellos. And so you get a little more detail. It allows me the flexibility to say, in the arrangement, maybe the cellos aren't coming through as much as I would like. I can bring that fader up and create a rebalancing of the orchestra. Not so much about the orchestra balancing itself, but balancing the orchestra to the rest of the instrumentation that's on the album. Okay, what does all this sound like? Well, that's always a good question. So let's go in and solo up these strings. And more than likely, maybe, yes, the string chamber came up. And again, this is an after-the-fact processing. Before I embarrass myself, let me go ahead and just play you what the strings would sound like. You'll note here, even in the fader world, that those standard microphones, the ones that are capturing the bulk of the orchestra sound, they are at nominal. They are basically attenuated. Whereas the rear microphones are less prominent than the front ones. And here's the spot miking, the sections, the violin one, the twos, the cellos, the violas. Wow, what a difference. And just as I said, often it's the cellos and to some degree the violas that are going to get buried in all of those guitars bass guitars who happen to be sharing a lot of the same register, whereas the violins are kind of on their own in many ways. They stand out. There's more players for one, and those parts come through the mix more. And we'll sort of look at how that sounds. So here's what the strings are doing. Cool. They don't sound quite so large. I have a feeling there's some processing missing. We'll see where that goes. But here's one of the differences. What's labeled double here, this is a second take of the string players. And I'm not using any spot microphones. This is just the sort of grouping sound. This is my overdubbed section, as it were. Let me take them out of the solo so we just hear the more featured take, the more featured take, good way to think of it. Now that sounds a little intimate, which is nice, but it's not having quite the lush quality that I'm after. Let me bring the doubles back into where we are. And something tells me, well, I usually don't. I'd be curious to know. Let's kill this. And let's go back and solo up the strings. I usually don't just open up everything, but maybe I did. Yeah, I guess I did this time. Okay, so there is a doubled set of those front microphones and a combination of the fronts and rears from the second take. So we add that in, and it sounds more like this. Okay, now let's see about where is the processing on all these guys. A little bit of the string chamber is present, but I have a feeling I'm actually sending it somewhere else. It's not necessarily getting picked up. It doesn't look like it. These are some dry strings, boys. Now, why is that? I know why. Two reasons. One, I initially did have a larger ensemble happening. Here's what's going on. I am sending it to a chamber software program, but let me bring this little window that I am seeing on my other screen over to show you. I'm running so much processing that even though I'm sending it to this processor, it is sadly disabled. My little setup can't handle all of the plugins that I'm running on this. Now, on the surround mixes for the album, you'll find I was able to figure out a solution to root around this problem. And there is additional reverberation on the strings for the 5-to-1 mixes. But in the stereo mixes, it's being sent here to this channel, but the computer is not actually processing it. So the strings are dry, which is not the way you're supposed to do it. On the other hand, in the context of all of the big drums reverberating, the electric guitars pushing, etc., in a way on the stereo mix without making the strings reverberant, they cut through the mix a little bit better. So even though they sound strange to my ears, and maybe to yours as well, without that processing, they may work more effectively in the stereo field by being dry. That's why I decided to just leave it that way. Okay, so drums, strings, big part of it, but not everything, obviously. Let's get rid of these solos. Let's play a little bit of the track in full.
Moment I held the light so everyone could see. Leave it to me.
Okay, so what's going on there? Well, musically in the arrangement, I asked Ben, I was like, when it gets to this section, do more just sort of sitting on the toms in some sort of pattern. And it's going to be just an atmospheric moment. But I didn't really have a sense of what was supposed to fill that time. I go ahead, I write the orchestration. So you hear all those swells and you hear the silence. That was all part of it. So I thought for a long time, well, musically, let's just create that as sort of a drama of tension and release, build, and whatever, all the time the drums are cooking away. But as I got closer to finalizing mixes, I thought, I'm not sure why we're doing this. Why is nothing happening? Why is there no vocal? Why is there no solo? What's going on? And I'd been doing this work with my student ensembles at UMass Lowell. And one of them was Pink Floyd. We had been sort of recreating Pink Floyd albums. And a big part of classic 70s Floyd are the way they incorporate sound effects into the music. So yes, sometimes it's just those alarm clocks, right? But sometimes it's actually becomes part of the texture that you can't really separate sound effects from the musical experience. We found it was essential for us to replicate those sound effects when we performed. So I was thinking about, well, sound effects kind of help create atmosphere as well. I thought about the lyric, especially the verse that's about to come up that eventually concludes with, think of the night just like a train. So I thought, all right, let's create an atmospheric train setting. And that's what I went about doing. So this was all done very late in the game. The most of the of this song was recorded already, including the strings. And then I went back and created through these things here. Train 1, Train 2, Train 3, 4, crickets, an ambient field. This is my version of a soundscape. And let me go ahead and just solo up these notions here. At first, let's start with what you hear. Once the band stops playing, we go to Ben's drums alone. We end up with just this sound. Crickets and what I'm calling an ambient field with train. So what did I do? Well, there's a great thing I'd recommend for any of you who are into sound design work. There's a great online source called freesound.org. And what it is folks just put all sorts of recordings they've made of environmental sounds. Maybe it's birds, maybe it's the ocean, maybe it's some factory producing something god-awful, but it makes a really cool sound. They record these, they put them up. Many of them are covered by Creative Commons as licenses. So the idea is they would wish for people to use these sounds in some sort of creative way, often with some sort of attribution. So I went to Free Sounds and I just started checking, well, who's made ambient field recordings, who's made recordings of trains, etc. And what can I find? So I found a hybrid. I found one of these crickets that was helpful and one of this sort of field sound, a little bit of wind, a little bit of rumbling, a little more of those crickets. It happened to have a train in the distance and one of those wonderful little, sometimes you get lucky. It turned out that the sound of that train, I'll play it again. It'll come back again. That happened to be in the same chord tonality of the orchestral swell I had written. So if we just solo up these ambient sounds plus the strings, you'll hear how they interact together. Etc. I was so happy. And I realized, okay, if I drop that in at the right points, we'll hear that train whistle signal that the strings should empty out, and they do, excuse me. And that'll be an interesting effect. It'll tie that sound effect to the musicians that are also playing. Now then, in addition to that, I ended up building you can see here, and if I zoom in, you can really see that I have laboriously looped, or not really looped by hand, all of these little short fragments of trains. And that's because in order to get what I wanted, actually let me take the strings out of solo. To get what I wanted, I needed these trains to sort of create a rhythmic pattern that was in with the drums. You can hear it's not actually it's a little bit lopsided. Is one train, the other one is this. Together. Now, if we add that into the drums, we'll do that by doing this. You'll hear how that relates. Okay, stop. That shows us the last bit, which was these other trains that I added just at the end. These are train horns. Let me get rid of the drums for just a second so we hear those on their own. Yeah, I know. But that's to emphasize that dynamic hit where we suddenly emphasize the sort of hemiola moment. I'll bring that in with the drums again. Okay. Yeah, I know. But what it did do for me was create a soundscape that drew a picture for that last verse. And that's one of the cool things that we can do with, non-guitar sound effects oriented sound design. And having done that and really felt like it helped the track a lot, I ended up going back and adding more sound design elements to other songs on the record. So this was an important one for me, almost at the mixing stage before we completed the record. All right, so that's basically what I wanted to show you for the deeper version of what's in this track for Think of the Night. Let's see if there's anything else of real note. I don't think there necessarily is. There's an incredibly basic layout here. There's drums, bass guitar, Greg Porter, my old friend from Birdsong, etc. And Thomas Giuliano playing electric guitar. One track, there's no solo, he's just playing his thing. And what's interesting is that when Thomas came in to record, we were just sort of, I don't know, let's see what you got. And he was just playing along to the track, very free form, but he came upon a melodic idea. And both of us realized, that's becoming something bigger than just a spontaneous one-time only moment. So we developed it into this little melodic motif that signals what happens in the song. It doesn't happen at the beginning. Let's see where we first encounter it. I know where I can find it by looking for my strings. Where do the strings actually start playing? There they are. So somewhere around here. And we'll hear the melody that Thomas stumbled upon just while we were recording it, that we then would repeat throughout every time we got to the end of a chorus. It became a motif.
Everyone believe it to me.
All right, we get the idea. Okay, so I think we have many more things we can discover in the album as we go through. But if you have thoughts or questions, post them in comments, and I can try to respond to those. Be happy to share anything about the particular processing we're using, why I EQ drums the way I do. Maybe some of you were looking at the way I am grouping my drums and noted that there is a drum group here but also a kick group here. Maybe just quickly look at what that means. This is because there are two microphones on the kick drum, one inside the drum, one on the outside of the drum. I'm combining those signals. I'm sort of balancing them, EQing them separately, and then sending them here to this group where I apply even more EQ curve. And again, this is really radical, what it's doing. And then a lot of EQ engineers will notice this. It's the usual carving out material that's not really useful in terms of the drum having any identity. The low tone is left, a little bit of the beater up here on top, and the stuff above the fundamental being cut out. It is also being compressed. And I'll show you that through a simulator of a TubeTech compressor. I used, back when I was doing studio work, had real TubeTech machines with me and found that I really liked how they worked with bass guitar and how they worked with kick drum, low end related stuff. Compression is simply a way of reducing dynamic range. Maybe it's not simply that, but that's the idea, meaning it makes the loudest things a little less loud, the quietest things a little less quiet. There's less variation. Now, that's in many ways working against a musician's impulse to impose some dynamic. But like in the case of Ben playing drums to just my thin little guitar and a click track, that kick drum might not necessarily, like every time, he may occasionally overhit it, thinking, well, I think Alan's going to want a big hit here. Or maybe under hitting it because there's no need. He's not fighting anything. There's nothing for him to play to. So there may be a slight inconsistency of dynamic in that kick drum when I get to the final mix, thinking, I'd love it if the kick drum didn't disappear as much or didn't pop through on that one hit. That's too hard. I could go in and automate those things, but I can let a compressor do that in a gentler way. And that's what I've chosen to do. It's not, if I go back, I think, and look at that setting, it's hopefully not particularly radical. Not really. It's a little bit of gain to get there. The ratio is set so it's barely getting hit. And let's even just look at that. So you're watching the kick drum. It's actually hitting it harder than I would have thought. So it must be doing something in the mix then. You see the needle moving back. That's reducing its dynamic range. If I bypass this effect, and now I see why I'm doing what I'm doing. I'm actually using this to bring the overall level of the kick up while making sure it never peaks above a certain amount of energy, throwing the whole mix out of balance. So we hear the kick drum is now louder, having brought the compressor in. Bypassing. Back in. It's always fun to listen to Ben solo. Anyway, that gives us, I think, an insight into how I approach drums, how I approach the string orchestra in terms of balancing and recording. And we'll get into some of the other finer points about how to deal with guitars and vocals, etc. in other episodes. But that's it for this deep dive. Think of the Night, the opening track from my album Currents. And thanks for tuning in. Hope to see you on more deep dives. Take care, everybody.